Today's seminar is Understanding FDA Regulations, Key Insights for 503A and 503 Compounding. This is our standard disclaimer because we're a bunch of lawyers, so you could read that at your own pace when you want. We are a national boutique, Frier Levitt, and we are very, very active in this compounding space. And my name is Martha Ramori. I'm senior counsel at Frier Levitt. I'm a pharmacist and attorney with over 20 years of experience representing pharmacy clients on various FDA regulatory, compounding, and state board of pharmacy compliance issues. I also head up the firm's IP practice. And previously, I served as director of drug regulatory affairs in the pharmaceutical industry and as an associate director of pharmacy at several hospitals in New York City. Today's part one, it's a three-part series, and today is Mastering GLP Compounding Regulatory Insights. And I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues, Day Lee and Lucas Morgan. And together we're going to explore the current regulatory landscape for compounding pharmacies, including the current regulatory environment for 503A and 503B compounding, state laws and State Board of Pharmacy updates, key regulatory considerations in the 503B to 503A compounding model for community pharmacists, 506E shortages and beyond, and we're going to touch also on USP 797, 795 6 months later. Day, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Day Lee. I'm a partner and a pharmacist at Frier Levitt. I represent various stakeholders in the pharmacy industry, ranging from pharmacies to employers, and provide a wide range of services, including without limitation, challenging PBM audits, termination, and making sure that pharmacies operate their businesses in accordance with the applicable laws and regulations. I also co-chair the firm's plan sponsor practice group. Just to give you a bit of description of our firm is that, we provide a one-stop shop for pharmacies. And we've represented thousands of pharmacies for over 25 years. We have over 50 attorneys who are subject matter experts in healthcare and life science industry, such as myself, Martha, and Lucas. And I collaborate with many of them to achieve the best result for my client. I'll turn it over to Lucas.
Thank you, Day. Lucas, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Day. I am also a partner here at Frier Levitt, and I work primarily in the litigation setting, and I would also say that includes arbitration as well. And then in another setting, which I would describe as being quasi-litigation, which is working in the administrative realm with boards of pharmacy. And I've had the honor and privilege of working with pharmacies in many states throughout the country, very close to nearly all 50 states in some way, shape, or form. Relevant to our discussion today, I've represented pharmacies of all types: specialty pharmacies, retail pharmacies, smaller operations, independent pharmacies, as well as larger chain pharmacies, but also a lot of compounding pharmacies. And I would say that that's especially relevant to discussions of Board of Pharmacy work, and we've definitely seen an increase in that. So a lot of experience working in the Board of Pharmacy space.
Thank you, Lucas. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. The webinar is going to be recorded. You'll receive a link to review the webinar on demand. During the presentation, you can send us questions using the Q&A tab on your screen. The questions are private. They're visible only to the presenters. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. If you'd like us to answer your question at a later date, our emails and phone numbers are included on the screen, so feel free to contact us anytime. Part two of the series is scheduled for June 20th, where Jesse Dresser and Ariel Milambro will cover innovative business models and reimbursement strategies, navigating telehealth, kickback regulations, and payment challenges. So with that, let's get started. So pharmacy compounding is an important component of pharmacy practice. It's essential to the provision of healthcare. And that's something that has always been. There's a great deal of buzz in the pharmacy community around compounding, especially the weight loss products, and particularly semaglutide compounding, and now the class of GLP-1 agonists. The legal skirmishes regarding compounding have been around for decades, and they've intensified and increased. At the firm, we have a multitude of legal and regulatory issues that our clients present us with on a daily basis involving the challenges that are faced by pharmacy compounders. So this three-part series focuses on the opportunities and the challenges that are presented in the compounding environment. And we're going to be looking at some key regulatory developments to watch. Looking at that pharmacy landscape, we see both opportunities and challenges. And today, and in part 2 and 3 of the webinar series, we're going to explore some of these opportunities and challenges. We're going to look at various distribution scenarios of the 503A compounded products among trading partners. We're going to look at transfers. We're going to look at oversight by state boards of pharmacy, particularly focusing on semaglutide and tirzepatide compounding. We're going to look at the complexities of intellectual property and GLP-1 compounding and advertising, and that's basically part 3 of the series. The regulatory landscape, we're going to look at the patchwork of state laws concerning pharmacies where, the state boards of pharmacy have really ramped up enforcement when it comes to 503A compounding by pharmacies. But for the most part, they have very little authority to regulate or have decided to actually defer oversight of physician compounding to the state boards of medicine. If you think this buzz about compounding is going to go quiet sometime in the near future, you really couldn't be more wrong, because FDA's 2024 guidance agenda includes at least half a dozen guidances that pertain to compounding. So stay tuned. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Day Lee.
Thanks, Martha. All right, so 503A versus 503B pharmacy. So there are, two categories of compounding pharmacies. These two types are 503A and 503B compounding pharmacies. While the FDA has approved the individual medicines used in a compounding pharmacy, it does not approve compounded drugs like traditional prescription drugs, including their dosage, and route of administration. So the FDA cannot confirm the safety or efficacy of a compounded drug as it does for commercially manufactured drugs. So the FDA has designated 503A compounding pharmacy as those that compound according to individual patient-specific prescriptions that are ordered or authorized by written or authorized by prescribers. And these are required by State Board of Pharmacy to comply with USP and other guidelines. So, for example, a 503A pharmacy may compound medication for a patient with allergies to an inactive ingredient in their prescription medication. To make the drug safe for that patient with allergies, the pharmacies and pharmacists at the 503A compounding pharmacy may isolate the active ingredient and particular drug and stabilize it with an active component. And the FDA, contrary to that, the FDA has designated 503B compounding pharmacies as those with outsourcing facilities that may manufacture large batches with or without prescriptions to be sold to a healthcare facility for office use only. Obviously, this capability allows the 503B to lower the manufacturing costs and offer more affordable medications to consumers. Also, when medications are on the FDA shortage list, 503B may produce compounded versions of those for widespread distribution that my colleagues Martha and Lucas will discuss later today, about semaglutide purchases from 503B by 503A. In any event, because of that, 503B compounding pharmacies are held to higher regulatory standards than traditional 503A compounding pharmacies. And outsourcing facilities must be registered with the FDA and complying with the CGMP validation and testing. again, these drugs are exempt from FDA approval and mandate to be labeled with adequate directions for use. So now, unlike 503A, 503B, again, must validate every process according to CGMP. But on the other hand, 503A, they must comply with USP along with various, State Board of Pharmacy regulations. So is 503A and 503B, like in my mind, like, putting aside the different regulations, I think the main difference from the practical standpoint, point of view is the 503A is for specific patient needs, but 503B, you don't require specific patient prescriptions. Next slide, please. No, Lucas, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah, right there. All right, so when FDA inspects a compounding facility seeking to operate under 503A, these inspections generally cover an evaluation of the company's compliance with Section 503A, as well as identification of any insanitary conditions. And when FDA inspects 503B outsourcing facilities, those inspections cover, the evaluation of the 503A facilities compliance with Section 503B, and also evaluation of insanitary conditions, but plus compliance with the CGMP. I also want to point out that like many compound pharmacies who believe that they are exempted from CGMP, instead, they found themselves subject to discipline and enforcement action for non-compliance because their prescription did not meet the 503A exemption. So some common reasons for prescriptions that fail to meet the 503A exemption include compounding and dispensing without receipt of a prescription, compounding before receiving a prescription when there is no pharmacist-physician relationship for orders, regarding a specific patient, or like compounds that deviate from the prescribed drugs made in bulk without a prescription, compounding regular or inordinate amount of drugs that are commercially available. There's a host of issues that contribute to common reasons for prescription failing to meet the 503A exemption. And again, pharmacists should be aware of the fact that the state boards of pharmacies, they cooperate with the FDA and often accompany the FDA on the inspection. During the inspection, FDA identifies, Board of Pharmacy issues, the agency prepares a referral letter to the board. So what I'm trying to say is, whether you're 503A or 503B, you have to make sure that you comply with the federal regulation, but also state level regulations to the extent applicable. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, Lucas. Previous slide. The next one. No, the next one, please. Slide 11. Common regulatory compliance issues. Yeah, I mean, this is pretty much self-explanatory. It's a list of common, regulatory compliance issues. I think, pharmacists should be aware of it and be cognizant of it and make sure that, pharmacies have robust policy and procedures and, make sure that you have internal protocols to avoid these common pitfalls. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm going to combine this slide and the next one into, one discussion. So right now, syringes are being compounded for, semaglutide and other twin creatinines such as tirzepatide, right? When a drug is on the shortage list, compounders are permitted to prepare a compounded version of the drug, such as Ozempic, Wegovy, and semaglutide and tirzepatide have been on the FDA shortage list since, I think, 2022, mainly due to the popularity of these drugs for both diabetes and weight loss. So since both semaglutide and tirzepatide are FDA-approved drugs and are on the shortage list, they can be compounded by 503A for specific patient prescription needs and for 503B for non-patient specific use. Both 503A and 503B, however, prohibit compounding of drugs that are essentially copies of FDA-approved drugs. But exception is if the approved drug is on the shortage list, then you can. And once the product is taken off of the list, 503B will not be able to compound it. But I think I believe there is a 60-day grace period only applicable to 503B, where large orders may be in process already, where at the time the drug is taken off of the list. 503A can still compound if there's a medical necessity. But, obviously those may face challenges regarding sourcing of API and whatnot. But again, at that point, 503A pharmacy is required to document medical necessity for the compounded prescription product. Or the pharmacy should contact the prescriber to a certain medical necessity and document the same in their records. And one thing that I also wanted to highlight is that the 503A pharmacy will not be able to buy the compounded prescription from another 503A because the 503A pharmacy cannot supply to another 503A for office use. So I think you should keep in mind that only semaglutide injection is on the shortage list and not the oral commercially available product. So still a 503A can compound oral semaglutide using either commercially available product or bulk API if there is a medical need. So since the oral form of semaglutide is not on the shortage list, pharmacy will need to justify the reason for compounded product itself, medical necessity. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So again, the compounded drugs are not FDA approved and do not undergo pre-market, review for safety, effectiveness, or quality, right? So while the compounds are not FDA approved, the FDA approved drugs in the compounds are often prescribed for off-label use. However, off-label promotion is not permitted. Marketing compounded products is very common source of regulatory scrutiny for compounding pharmacies. Like, for example, I believe FDA made numerous referrals to state board of pharmacies regarding pharmacy promoting use of compounded ivermectin for COVID-19, and there have been cases against 503A pharmacies for marketing materials that indicate they compound, ketamine for depression, finasteride for hair loss, or topical Abilify for pain. So, to sum it up, you can't, 503A pharmacies cannot, or compound pharmacies cannot make any safety or efficacy claims, when promoting their, products. They should really promote their service, not specific products. Next slide, please. All right, so API vetting, which is one of the hot topics that are at issue right now in the industry. So several challenges pertaining to API vetting, include like dependency on foreign imports and shortages of semaglutide, bulk API. Most API manufacturers are located outside of the United States, such as in China or India. And often API can be purchased from like procurement pharmaceutical companies or sourcing firms, wholesale distributors, or third-party logistic providers, 3PLs. So 503A is very important for 503A to vet the API and the API manufacturers. More specifically, when vetting API manufacturers, 503A pharmacies it is essential for them to have effective communication with the API importer. Contracts with API vendors, should be written to mitigate the risk and ensure reliability. quality assurance, regulatory compliance, supply chain resilience and capacity, reliability. All those are key considerations for 503A when vetting API and API manufacturer. And also, pharmacies should obtain like written assurance that API suppliers comply with regulatory standards such as GMP. And we have to make sure that API suppliers are registered or listed on the FDA website as API manufacturer or supplier. And API should also should only be purchased from establishments registered with FDA. If the manufacturer is a foreign establishment, then they must be registered under Section 510 of FDCA, and the pharmacy should obtain the proof of the same. But at the same time, like right now, many compounders have unknowingly purchased research use only semaglutide for API for compounding, and FDA and a number of state board of pharmacies have issued warning letters about this. Research use only, or RUO, means that API or the excipient is not pharmaceutical grade, is not a pharmaceutical grade, and cannot be ingested. And RUO products are not registered by are not regulated by FDA. So it's we have to make sure that we're not 503A compounders have to make sure that they're not purchasing RUO products. Okay, one other thing that I want to go over is a certificate of analysis, right? So COA or C of A, it must be from the original manufacturer and not transcribed or not translated into English by importer or another entity. Pharmacy is required to obtain an original C of A from the manufacturer, not the relabeler or the distributor. And the COA must include, all the required USB testing, and as well as the, information about the the latest USB version. And lastly, I want to highlight that pharmacists must develop a robust policy and procedures to vet the API manufacturers and the API that they're purchasing. Check the FDA website, looking further for any warning letters or recalls. A pharmacist should request a copy of the original C of A and a statement from the distributor that the API is a pharmaceutical grade. So there's a slew of potential regulatory risk, but these can be navigated with the assistance from the legal counsel or industry expert. Next slide. Okay, so again, 503A cannot sell it to another 503A. Okay, 503A is only for specific patient prescription needs. And, again, Lucas and Martha will go over this. 503A can't right now, they can purchase semaglutide from another 503B. But once 503A purchased from 503B, you have to dispense it to the patient. You can't sell it to another 503A, or you can't sell it to a hospital or a doctor's office. Okay, 503A is for patient. 503B can make it on a bulk quantities and then sell it to 503A. I'll turn it over to Martha.
Thank you, Day. I'm sure that our attendees got many takeaways and insights to that very excellent talk. I want to continue a little bit about distribution of compounds and distribution issues. There's confusion regarding distribution. That's something that my colleagues Day and Lucas and I are constantly opining on. And so some of the scenarios that come up with semaglutide and tirzepatide compounded distribution models. But before we even begin to talk about distribution, I want to discuss briefly the case Wellness Pharmacy versus Becerra. And that's an important case. It was decided in 2021. It pertained to the 5% limit permitting interstate distribution in quantities that are less than 5%. So the FDA at that time had proposed a controversial MOU regarding interstate distribution of compounds by pharmacies. And one of the controversial issues was the conflation of the words distribution with dispensing pursuant to a prescription. And so the pharmacies sued FDA for not following for that and for not following the notice and comment period procedures that are in the Regulatory Flexibility Act. And so what happened is that FDA then suspended this MOU that the states were going to agree to. And while FDA now goes back to this comment rulemaking process, they do not intend to enforce that statutory 5% limit on interstate distribution of compounded drugs. So, that could change. The MOU was going to increase it to something like 50% if there were more reporting requirements from the states with regard to compounds, things like ADR reporting and stuff like that. Next thing to discuss with distribution is anticipatory compounding. So this mostly pertains to the 503A pharmacies. There are limits on quantities that a 503A pharmacy can compound. They can either compound, as Day mentioned, for an individual patient or anticipation of receiving a prescription based on a history of prescriptions that they've received. They can compound not more than a 30-day supply, but they actually can't release, what they've compounded until they receive the prescription. So there's no such thing as, office stock releasing the prescriptions without the compounds without a prescription. They can only release it to a prescriber's office if it's patient-specific, but again, not for office stock. So the question, can a 503A transfer a compound to a physician dispenser for office use? And again, that's no. Can a 503B transfer a compound to a 503A community pharmacy for dispensing pursuant to an individual prescription? And the answer here has changed. The answer is now, it seems to be yes. The FDA issued some clarification in a recent draft guidance entitled Prohibition on Wholesaling by 503B Outsourcing Facilities. And that draft guidance came out in June of 2023. And it has specific language that says the compound may be sold from a 503B to a pharmacy, hospital, or clinic for administration or further dispensing. And previously what was allowed was 503B to, hospitals and health systems. So this is a significant, event. Like I say, it's a draft guidance. It remains to be seen. It might change. There might be a final guidance. There were lots and lots of comments from pharmacy folks, pharmacy organizations that think that that might affect the 503As not wanting to compound, since the 503, they can get the compounds from the 503B, but then again, a 503B cannot compound everything that a 503A can compound. So there's differences there as well. And another question, can a 503A transfer a compounded prescription to another 503A? You've heard this 3 times now. No pharmacy to pharmacy transfer for, it has to be, dispensed to a specific patient. Can a physician compounder, and physicians compounders, they're 503As, can they transfer or sell the compounds that they make to a different physician practice for dispensing to a specific patient? And again, since the physicians are 503A compounds, they cannot compound for office use for another physician. Can a 503B compound be sold to a 503A for further dispensing prior to when the prescriptions are received? And the answer to that is yes, because a 503B can compound for office use. The next bullet point there is in a telemedicine model. Can a 503A purchase stock from a 503B directly, or must a telemedicine company purchase it from a 503B and then have it shipped to the 503A? So you're going to have to stay tuned to part 2 for the answer to that, because that's part of our part 2, the telemedicine distribution models. It's going to be discussed in there. So this is coming soon, Ed, for part 2, that bullet point. Can a physician have a 503B product shipped to his or her office in one state, and then that office is transferring to another commonly owned practice in another state, where, for example, where the 503B was not licensed, someplace like California. So the answer is no. You can't circumvent the states, by these arrangements. Next slide, please. So the next thing I want to talk about is this, 503B to 503A model briefly. And as I mentioned, that was from a draft guidance on June 27, 2023. And it's a new development. It's important to stay ahead of any, changes to that. But the compounded medication cannot be altered in any way. The compound that comes from a 503B to a 503A, it can't be repackaged other than placing maybe the pharmacy's label on it. It can't be broken or split into different dosages. It can't be wholesaled by the pharmacy. It can't be transferred to another pharmacy or physician's office, even for, dispensing for an individual patient. And while the pharmacy can't transfer a 503B compounded medication to the physician for administration to the patient, as the medication cannot be sold or transferred by an entity other than the outsourcing facility that compounded the drug, the 503B itself can dispense a compounded medication to a physician's office for administration, either as office stock or pursuant to a prescription for an individual patient. Could I have the next slide, please? So again, I mentioned it's a draft guidance, and the 503 outsourcing facility must be registered with the State Board of Pharmacy for each state that it's shipping compounded drugs to. It can't, get around that requirement. There is a state-by-state patchwork, if you will, for there's no actual model standards for state licensure for these 503Bs. Various states require these outsourcing facilities to be licensed as pharmacies, like New York. Some categorize them as drug wholesalers or manufacturers. Some states, like Ohio, regulate 503B facilities as wholesalers. Some states have created an entirely new regulatory regime for them. And in any state where a 503B dispenses patient-specific prescriptions, it has to be registered as a pharmacy.
So Martha, just to be clear, you're saying that 503B pharmacies or 503B facilities that are shipping into other states for 503A must maintain active license, right?
Absolutely. They can't just be shipping and say, oh, well, the pharmacy's got a license. They have to be shipping into any state that if they're shipping to 503A, they have to be licensed in that state that they're shipping to. And not only do they have to be licensed, but if the 503B is selling to a 503A pharmacy, say, for example, located in Louisiana for dispensing to patients, they have to adhere, the 503B has to adhere to all the Louisiana rules pertaining to 503B facilities. Like every state, like I said, has their own patchwork. Delivery of filled prescriptions to providers, physicians, nurse practitioners for administration to the patient is permitted. However, the prescription must be a patient-specific prescription and not for office use. So the compound comes from a 503A. It goes to a 503, comes from a 503B. It goes to a 503A, and the 503A can then just take that and then, distribute it to a physician's office, because it has to be patient-specific. There can't be any office use. Can I have the next slide, please? Here, this talks about the pharmacy. The pharmacy has to hold out-of-state licenses in the states that it's shipping compounds into. So just because it's coming from a 503B doesn't mean that if it's the pharmacy is filling prescriptions for example, for the state that the 503B is licensed in, but the 503A is not licensed in, the pharmacy still has to be licensed in that state. that they're just, when they're dispensing these prescriptions. The step can't be bypassed because the 503B is the source of the compound. The other thing just to keep in mind, there should be a contract in place between the 503A pharmacy and the 503B facility. The contract should be very specific, should address things like adverse events, quality of patients sold, quality of the product sold, recalls, out of spec notifications, timelines for reporting out of spec to the pharmacy, the costs of any recalls, who's going to pay for the recalls. The quality, safety, and appropriateness of the preparations is the fiduciary responsibility of the dispensing pharmacy and the pharmacy. It's not transferable. And you have to remember that a 503B outsourcing facility, they're not a manufacturer. So the products that are made by these 503Bs, they're not covered by the same product liability laws and limits as those from an FDA-approved GMP manufacturers. So an indemnification clause in the contract is very important. There's shared liability between the pharmacy customer and the 503B, which, underscores that a thorough vetting process, which Jay spoke about, it's of the utmost importance when selecting a 503B outsourcing partner. A pharmacy cannot purchase 503B compounds from anyone other than directly from a 503B. And pharmacy cannot purchase these compounds from a repackager. They can't purchase them from a wholesaler. The 503B compounds, they're not allowed to do that. And we, recommend for our clients that they attain assurances from any 503B facility that the compound meets specifications, because if a recall is necessary, sometimes there's an out-of-spec lot or something like that. If a recall is necessary, there should be some kind of a document, the contract, that says how long, the pharmacy is going to be notified within, 2 hours, 3 hours. It's not like something you want to find out about by looking at the FDA website for recalls and finding out that there was a recall. So there has to be a reporting mechanism back and forth. 503Bs must report adverse events. They're required to do so via the MedWatch. So if the pharmacy receives any reports of adverse events, they should have a policy and procedure in place on how that's going to be handled in submitting those adverse events to the 503B for then reporting onto the MedWatch. And so that's an important consideration because, a patient complaint from an adverse event could be made to the Board of Pharmacy, to the FDA, or both by a patient, and then that often triggers an inspection. And so one of the ways to mitigate that risk would be to display the name of the compounding facility and the contact information itself, on the label. Even though the pharmacy itself is not doing the compounding, they have to appropriately store the compound prior to dispensing. Since this model is new, one of the things that I've mentioned on the bottom there, I won't go into too much detail, but it might help mitigate the risk that a Board of Pharmacy might decide that this 503B to 503A model is not in accordance with pharmacy rules. And that is to try to seek to fit the arrangement within the contours of a central fill arrangement. And that's something we've looked at for a number of our clients. So this slide, Jay went into a lot of this already about the 506E shortage list. It's an ever-changing list of drugs in short supply. And one of the things, to keep in mind is that if it's on the shortage list, essentially a copy, can be compounded because the FDA doesn't consider the drug on shortage to be commercially available. The manufacturer's patent doesn't prohibit such compounding because the FDA permission to compound medications on shortage makes no mention of patents, and to do so would fly in the face of the purpose of the FDA shortage list. And a lot more on patents and trademarks and advertising and litigation is going to be discussed in part 3 of this series on June 26th.
Martha, can you reiterate what happens after the injection is off of the shortage list, and then what's going to happen to 503A and 503B?
So I think you touched on this, but the 50 once it gets off the shortage list, the 503B will not be able to compound it, and they won't be able to supply it to the 503A. And so, you know, the pharmacies are going to be having to either compound it themselves, find some other mechanism, you know, maybe the central fill or something like that. But you know, that's one of the drawbacks of getting compounds from a 503B. There's only certain things they can compound, and pharmacies, you know, have more leadway in you know, basically what they can compound. So at that point, the pharmacy would then have to document. It couldn't, even if it comes off the list and it couldn't compound essentially a copy, there would have to be a medical necessity documentation. And the pharmacy, you know, that documentation, there's specific requirements for what has to be on that documentation. Next slide, please. So the next thing I just want to briefly talk about is the USP 795, which is for non-sterile compounding, and 797 for sterile compounding. We're like 7 months into the changes that became applicable on November 1st, 2023. And there are a few things that are actionable steps for pharmacies to prioritize to comply with the most recent guidelines. So these are just some, and again, the USP is for 503A only. 503Bs, they have to follow the good manufacturing practices. It's more stringent than the USPNF. But some of the compliance gaps that have been identified so far, these in the 7 months pursuant to the FDA inspections, what we see is SOPs. Okay, the SOPs need to be reviewed every 12 months. And there has to be a designated person. That designated person has to have a second evaluator evaluating them. The environmental monitoring has increased. That's another area that there's a lot of problems with, environmental monitoring, visual smoke study, adding a dry heat sterilization oven for depyrogenation of glassware, metal, and other thermostable components, checking the effectiveness of biological indicators using spores such as bacillus and things like that. The other area that's problematic is the master formulation record, MFRs. Those are standards, instructions for consistent compounding, as well as the compounding records, which is the actual process steps that you use for compounding. Garbing competency evaluation, there's a lot more on garbing than there ever was. For example, the required garb can only be worn on the clean side of the line of demarcation. Aseptic manipulation competency, there's self-testing on all these things. And certification reports for equipment, they have to be reviewed by designated personnel. And so beyond use dates, and that's another issue. Batch limits, 503A now can only batch, the maximum batch size is 250. And we have a lot of clients that think that that's way, way too small and that they would like to batch in much larger quantities. But the USP now is limited at limiting them to 250. And so beyond use date, if there's anything out of whack with that, that's serious, because that can be evidentiary for a defective product that can have quality issues. Such as stability or potency. For example, you can't give a 90-day beyond use date for a category 2 CSP, compounded sterile product, prepared using non-sterile starting components. And so, but all of these things on the beyond use date, they're all in the USP. So I would advise you to look over there. Next slide, please. These are just the changes, if you can read those on your own. For the USP 797, talks about the units. There's increases in monthly surface sampling, increases in requirements to re-qualify personnel that are doing the compounding. Next slide, please. Inspection readiness is key, and my colleague Lucas is going to talk about that in a minute. And the FDA, one of the things you should note is that even though there's 503As have to compound according to the USP, the FDA does inspect pharmacies according to the guidelines for insanitary conditions at compounding facilities. And some of take a look at that guidance because it does have some GMP components in there. So they're, in some regards, it's a higher standard than what the USP, is requiring. And I guess that's about it. We could talk more about the training. The thing that's on this slide about states going rogue is we have some states like California proposing rules that are beyond what the USP requires. And the facility requirements, you can't compound under the hood, one day sterile, next day non-sterile using a single hood. There's all sorts of requirements like that you're not allowed to. Accreditation, I just want to mention that there's a new credential from the Board of Pharmaceutical Specialties for board certified sterile compounding pharmacists. You want to set yourself apart. It's BCSCP. Many states require the VPP inspection from NABP. There's also the Pharmacy Compounding Accreditation Board from 8 organizations that have come together. You don't see 8 pharmacy organizations coming together very often, do you? So this is a very good. Looks like compounding's bringing everybody together. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Lucas.
Thank you so much, Martha. And just to kind of segue into a focus on Board of Pharmacy, everything that Day and Martha said has an application at the state Board of Pharmacy level. And I emphasize that word state Board of Pharmacy because there really is not a national Board of Pharmacy. There is the NABP, the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, but really boards of pharmacy have their power at the individual state level. Why is that so relevant here? It's because you also have substantial interplay with federal law. So what are some important points to keep in mind, or some of the mistakes or oversights that I often see? Well, the starting point is, and I think this has already been made very clear by both Martha and Day, there is a level of scrutiny by the state boards of pharmacy at a level that I haven't seen in quite some time. And I've been working with in the Board of Pharmacy realm for nearly 10 years. And it's almost as if boards of pharmacy have opened the floodgates for inspections, especially in the GLP-1 compounding space. They understand that there is a very high demand for these products. They understand that there is a legal ability to compound many of these products. And so they are concerned that with this very high demand, but limited supply of the products, there's going to be quality issues and concerns, concerns surrounding the product sourcing, which directly ties into the concerns related to quality. And then obviously, first and foremost, for many boards of pharmacy and pharmacies alike, patient safety concerns. One of the mistakes that I often see is the belief that if you are complying with applicable federal law, that you are protected from any potential violations of a state law. And another mistake that I often see is that where federal law is silent on an issue that may be regulated or governed under federal law, that it means that the pharmacy doesn't necessarily have to comply directly with applicable state laws. And that could not be more wrong. In one example that I'll talk about is, in a little more detail as we go through here, is mailing practices. And then in our next slide, I'll get into that in a little more detail. But think broadly about operational concerns and quality concerns. Something that I would describe as more operational is, how is the pharmacy going about getting its products to its patients or other third parties that it's working with? Mailing would be an example of that. Shipping. How are you doing that? Are you complying with your state's applicable rules and regulations from the Board of Pharmacy, but also any other states that you're doing business in or entering in this process? Quality concerns, make sure that all of your equipment is inspected, is up to date. Sanitary conditions, I cannot emphasize this enough. You should be operating in a capacity where you are under the impression that you could be inspected in a moment's notice, that any day an inspector could walk through the door. So I think you want to treat every day as if it's possible that an inspection could occur, and always make sure that your equipment is tested, inspected, up to date, and in absolute best sanitary conditions possible. Another operational consideration that is really getting a lot of scrutiny under these current circumstances is marketing practices. That's kind of analogous in many ways to the operational considerations with shipping and mailing. Make sure that as you're working with other third parties where there's contracts, Martha absolutely recommended having contracts in certain instances, which I could not agree with her more. But you want to make sure that those contracts comply with applicable federal and state law as well. Also keep in mind with marketing component, the use of telemedicine.
Lucas, going back to the federal law and state board of pharmacy regulation, am I correct that even though the FDA draft guidance allows 503B to sell semaglutide products to 503A, a specific or a particular board of pharmacy can still prohibit their, state pharmacy, 503A pharmacies from purchasing 503B from 503B, right?
Yeah, but I can just address that quickly. It seems like at least one state, I forgot which one it is, but at least one state has said it's okay, explicitly put it in their rules. So, and I haven't seen any state say it's not permitted
Got it.
yet. It's new, like we said.
Yeah, and building on that point, Day, is the notion that state boards of pharmacy absolutely can weigh in instances where the federal law enforcement authorities have spoken. They can complement and further enhance or bolster federal law. Now, you would typically want to states would be sensitive about doing something that directly conflicted with federal law, but they certainly can come in and either speak where the federal legislators and law enforcement officials have not, and they can certainly enhance and complement applicable federal law. Product sourcing concerns. Only buy from reputable sources. This goes without saying, but this is a point that most people would say, this is obvious, Lucas. I know that I need to buy from reputable sources. The problem is, what is your policies and procedures for vetting what constitutes a reputable source? Because I can assure you that right now in this marketplace where you're seeing such a heightened demand for these products, there's going to be numerous entities out there claiming that they're a reliable, reputable, safe source to purchase these products. So the onus is on you to ensure that you have a policy and procedure in place to vet and ensure and guarantee that you are truly actually buying from a reputable, safe source. Have all of your documentation readily available. Both Martha and Day talked about COAs, or certificates of analysis, and Day made the very important point, and I can't emphasize it enough, about making sure that you have a true certificate of analysis that comes from the original manufacturer, that is not translated, is not from a relabeler, and not from I'm going to say in our context, a US-based distributor. We see this issue all the time. Pharmacies are operating under the assumption that they have the necessary COAs on hand. So an inspector comes and says, I need to see your COAs, and they hand them over and they say, these aren't the right COAs. I need to see the ones from the original manufacturer. Oftentimes these COAs will look very similar and perhaps in some cases nearly identical. I would suggest that one thing you can do is make sure that you have a COA on hand from both any US-based distributors that you're working with, as well as the original manufacturer, so that you can ensure you've always got the correct ones on hand. you should insist on having these from any manufacturers or distributors that you're working with. And if you can't get them, that should be a red flag and a concern. Have them on hand. Don't deem it sufficient to have access to them or to be able to get them upon request, because boards of pharmacy will oftentimes say it's not enough to be able to get them to me at a later date, even if it's in a very short period of time. You need to have them on hand and available for my immediate inspection upon my arrival and request. As far as patient safety concerns, I think I've really covered it from the pharmacy perspective, but much like I really want pharmacies to have the onus on them to make sure they're working with reliable manufacturers and sourcers, you also need to make sure that when you decide to enter into relationships with other third parties for distribution, so on and so forth, that they too are highly qualified, reputable in doing everything in a legally compliant manner. Are you working with qualified prescribers of these products that you may be working with that are actually administering the product or handing off the product to the patients? Is there an established prescriber-patient relationship? This is critical. Again, it's not enough to have a very cursory, passive review of the qualifications of any third parties you work with. Your policies and procedures need to be such that you are the one vetting the quality and reliability of any third parties that you work with, whether it be other pharmacies, clinics, weight loss clinics, or prescribing physicians or medical practices. And again, these are all things that we are qualified to assist with. We can help you with that, whether it be directly vetting these individuals or third parties, as well as helping to prepare and create policies and procedures that are going to allow you to do this on your own. Mailing and shipping concerns. This is, again, one of those things where you see a lot of interplay between federal and state law. Certain pharmacies will operate under the assumption, Martha talked about this, the notion of a 5% rule. That is very, very often misunderstood by pharmacies and misapplied by pharmacies to their detriment. Just because federal law may permit the shipping of a certain minimal amount of products, which, as Martha suggested, is not even necessarily the case, but assume that federal law did say that pharmacies can ship a minimum number of products out of their home state without an issue at the federal level. That does not mean that you do not have to still comply with applicable state law. So if you're a pharmacy that's based in one state, and I'm just going to name a state off the top of my head, Texas, because I happen to do a lot of work there. Let's say you're starting to consider doing some business across state lines, and I'm going to use the state of Oklahoma as an example because it's a neighboring state, the Red River rivalry. I am going to suggest that if you're even going to do one prescription across state lines, you need to get licensed in that state. And I shouldn't even say suggest, you do. There are occasionally, in some states, exceptions. But if you're going to try to operate under a perceived exception, you better be 100% correct. And I'm going to suggest that relative to the costs associated with trying to litigate or fight with a board of pharmacy versus the cost of obtaining a second or third license in another state, it is much more cost efficient, smart, and in the best interest of you as a business and your patients to invest the money in getting licensed in that other state or states that you believe you might be doing some business in. I've said this before in other webinars, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's a perfect example. Don't try to argue an exception at a later date. Focus on compliance right out of the gate. As far as being proactive, know your home state's position on compounding for GLP-1 products, as well as any other state you're doing business in. How do you do this? The first source would be your state boards of pharmacy website. I can tell you right now, if you Google New Jersey Board of Pharmacy statement concerning semaglutide compounding, you're going to find a multiple page document. They've issued a statement. If you're based in New Jersey or you're doing business in New Jersey, you should know exactly what this says. I'm not necessarily telling you that that's going to answer every single question you have, but that's a document you should be reviewing. Let's say you're not doing business in New Jersey, it could at least be informative to you. Monitor board meetings, updates to pharmacy rules and regulations. This guidance, because this is a hot topic, could be coming down, in multiple doses, so to speak, no pun intended. Engage with your board. Do not take chances. If you have a question, get an answer. In my experience, boards are very responsive when you reach out. We can also assist with that type of outreach. Then the last thing I want to say is, do not forget the obvious. There's a heightened level of scrutiny. It's resulting in more inspections. Everything else that applies to your operation as a pharmacy is still in play. Another common mistake I see is checking every single box as it relates to the issues that are of the heightened scrutiny and focus, so the compounding, but forgetting about some of the more basic stuff, like staffing ratios, pharmacist to pharmacy technician ratios. That could be overlooked because you're very busy now because there's this heightened demand. Simple things like not properly posting all your new licenses because you've hired some new personnel, not having your hours properly posted, or not accounting for a change in hours because maybe you're staying open a little longer, but your hours reflect old hours. Those are little things that will often get picked up on and still result in formal disciplinary action. Some of the things we can do to help out with this type of thing is conduct mock inspections. You can work with reputable third-party consultants or a law firm or a combination of both, because oftentimes you have a hybrid of purely pharmacy issues or legal issues, but a lot of times they cross paths. So it can be great to be working with both a reputable law firm as well as third-party pharmacy consultants. So it's just after 2 o'clock. I'm going to wrap it up here. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Martha, Day, or myself. We thank you all for your time today. We hope you found this insightful and valuable. Just a reminder, the second part of the series is on June 20th. That again is going to be innovative business models and reimbursement strategies. And that should be another informative session that you're not going to want to miss. And again, any questions, reach out to any one of us and we can respond to you individually and directly. Thank you so much. Have a great day.